My name is Alexander Leslie. I'm a threat intelligence analyst with Recorded Future. If you like what you see today, if you have follow-up questions, want to engage more with my research, or send me hate mail, use that moniker on the bottom on social media. I get a lot of hate mail, so I'm very prepared for it. Obligatory disclaimer slide, as is tradition. So I see a lot of friends and familiar faces in the crowd. If you've ever seen a previous presentation of mine, this one is going to be very different. It's not going to be technical. We're not going to be dissecting any specific campaigns, any specific threat actors or tools, but rather this is a conceptual piece meant to ground you in the cyber threat landscape of 2024 and kind of figure out where hacktivism lies when it comes to assessing overall cybersecurity risk. My goal really is this. In 30 minutes or less, I hope to give you some tips and tricks to think more like a threat intelligence analyst when you're engaging with hacktivist content, whether on social media, on Telegram, other messaging platforms, on dark web and special access forums, so that you can better assess things like credibility, authenticity, and figure out maybe if there are some ulterior motives happening behind the scenes that might pose a threat to your organization. Hacktivist chatter is generally all over the news. It is all over social media, and it is largely junk. It is largely noise. It is very overwhelming. Ask any threat intel analyst. Over the last 2 years, we are overwhelmed with hacktivist claims that we are constantly trying to verify, constantly researching, and it is changing every single day. Groups go up and down within 24 hours. Collectives form and break apart within the span of a week. It is very difficult to track. So I hope this presentation will give you some guiding points. So if you ever find yourself in a situation where you're briefing a boss, an executive, or a policymaker, or you just need to have a well-informed conversation about hacktivism with a colleague or a coworker or a client, this presentation hopefully will give you some of those skills. And we're going to get there through these presentation goals. We're going to figure out where hacktivism sits in the contemporary threat landscape. We're going to understand how hacktivism serves propaganda purposes, and it uses that scare tactic, that marketing tactic of fear, uncertainty, and doubt in order to create fear, uncertainty, and doubt within the information security industry. And then we're going to learn about ways in which financially motivated threat actors, influence operators, and nation-state actors leverage hacktivist personas in order to conduct attacks and spread malign influence. So if you take nothing else away from this session, if you fall asleep right now after this slide, I want you to know this. Be patient. Exercise restraint and caution when dealing with hacktivist claims that you might see on social media. You might be shocked at the amount of individuals and organizations that I've effectively had to walk off cliffs over the last 2 years because they were really thinking about making serious strategic decisions within their organization over some unverified hacktivist garbage they saw reposted on LinkedIn. It happens like every week. Don't do that. That is effectively falling into the hacktivist trap, forcing your hand and baiting you to make a decision largely based on mis, or disinformation. So I'm going to reference this theme a lot throughout the presentation. This is called the fog of war, taken a lot from conflict theory and Clausewitz, but more so taken from George Lucas, the philosopher, not the director of Star Wars. If you have not read Ethics in Cyber Warfare, I highly recommend it, but Lucas effectively ascribes 3 non-mutually exclusive motivations to hacktivists, those being transparency, which is an external motivation, whistleblowing, which is an internal motivation, and vandalism, which is neither. The overwhelming majority of hacktivists fall into the vandalism camp. And the vandal usually has ulterior motives. The vandal usually has personal or financial motives. They're in it for the ego, they're in it for trolling, reputation, financial gain. This is primarily going to be the subject of this talk today. States recognize this. Influence peddlers recognize this. Financially motivated cybercriminal groups recognize that hacktivists are primarily vandals and agents of chaos. And it leads to something called state-sponsored hacktivism, where states either adopt hacktivist personas, this is often called pseudo-hacktivism or faketivism, or they allow patriotic hackers to operate within their borders as long as those so-called patriotic hackers serve state objectives. This is very famously a precedent with the 2007 DDoS attacks on Estonia, where Russian so-called patriotic hackers were allowed to operate with relative impunity in targeting Estonian entities, and the Russian government passed it off as, well, we don't have authority over the cybercriminal underground, therefore we have no authority over what private citizens decide to do in their free time. All of this together is very confusing. It's evolving constantly, it's constantly changing, and it leads to something called the attribution problem within threat intelligence. So if you ever hear this term in threat intel thrown around about attribution, it's largely, an epistemological question that George Lucas calls the issue of evidence. Evidence in threat intelligence is relatively vendor-specific, organization-specific, and government-specific. Therefore, not everyone at all times can agree on who is actually responsible for attacks, if attack actually occurred, and what evidence actually can corroborate that attack. All of this together contributes to a fog of war, a lot of confusion that you need to cut through, and you need to discern fact from fiction in order to kind of assess risks to your organizations or risk to your potential clients. So, up front, just be patient and exercise caution. We're going to go through, of course, an introduction, research questions, and then we're going to dive right into case studies with two ongoing conflicts happening in real time with hacktivist opportunism, those being Ukraine and the war in Israel and Palestine, and then we'll get into conclusions. So what exactly is hacktivism? Well, in the simplest terms, hacktivism is politically motivated cyber threat activity. But this definition really misses out on a lot of key points within hacktivism that make it so nuanced. I really like this definition from TechTarget because some of these key points are really shown here. Hacktivism is public-facing in nature. The hacktivist is usually never silent. They are usually very boastful and loud about their exploits. That is part of the messaging campaign. Hacktivism always intends to direct the public's attention to a cause, and that cause is not always inherently political. Some hacktivists just disagree with an organization's business practice, therefore they conduct a breach against them. Some hacktivist organizations target pretty indiscriminate, random individuals for personal reasons. Framing it only as political activity is a bit of an antiquated way of thinking about hacktivism and where it sits in 2024. And then the last point in this definition that's really important is most hacktivists work anonymously. This is largely intended to absolve them of accountability and criminal liability because hacktivism is still crime. There's an unfortunate undercurrent within threat intelligence that hacktivism is less sophisticated than cybercrime or espionage or influence operations. It's less interesting, it's more low level, and doesn't pose risks to a lot of organizations. And again, this is a bit of an antiquated way of thinking about hacktivism because it does encompass, as of 2024, financially motivated cybercrime, influence operations, and espionage that will kind of dissect in each of these case studies. So where exactly does hacktivism sit in 2024? This is from Recorded Future's annual report that we released last month, publicly accessible on our website. The long and short of it is that hacktivism and the barriers between political and financially motivated crime are increasingly blurring. Those silos are breaking down. We are observing hacktivists engaging in activities that we traditionally consider to be cyber-dependent or cyber-enabled crimes. We see hacktivists conducting exit scams of their followers on Telegram. We see hacktivists like GhostSec standing up ransomware as a service programs. Hacktivists like Killnet endorsing and setting up hacking forums, dark web marketplaces, including traditional dark web marketplaces that sell things like narcotics and weapons. We're also seeing hacktivists engaging in carding and cryptocurrency fraud, not typical things that hacktivists engaged in if you were a solely politically motivated group. So this is something to keep in mind kind of as we look at these case studies, is as we move from what hacktivism kind of originally was, or its simple definition of politically motivated cyber threat activity, it is moving further and further into financially motivated threat activity. So this is a graph from the Recorded Future platform. It represents approximately 250,000 references to unique hacktivist incidents over the last year. For those of you not familiar with Recorded Future and how it functions, a reference is really just a base unit of measurement. What it's doing is it's using AI, machine learning, and natural language processing to extract entities, locations, organizations, individuals, and curate references to those and kind of put them on a scatter plot. And what we see here is over the last year or so, a significant amount of hacktivist activity that generally aligns with geopolitical events. So, for example, you'll see here in October a significant spike in hacktivist threat activity aligned largely with Hamas's attack on October 7th on Israel. Big thing that we'll talk about later, but generally speaking, hacktivists are reactionary. Hacktivism is reactionary by nature. Therefore, there's going to be ebbs and flows in activity with regards to the news cycle. Hacktivists practice situational awareness as well as all the rest of us. Therefore, whenever something happens in the world, especially some kind of international instability, a lot of hacktivists are going to become opportunistic and capitalize on that instability and human suffering for personal or financial gain. So 250,000 references over a year is quite a lot. We have to kind of tone that down with some research questions, and it's really, what role does hacktivism play now, and how did we get here? How did we get to a point where what I knew of hacktivism when I was in elementary and middle school of, Project Chanology and Habbo hotel raids and broad things that were happening on certain nondescript image boards is not necessarily what hacktivism is in 2024. What happened from going from, trolling to a driver of malign influence? What should organizations be most concerned about, if anything, with regards to hacktivism? How does it intersect with other threats like cybercrime, influence operations, and espionage? And then how can you better defend yourself against hacktivist threats? And the spoiler alert on the last one is education and situational awareness. Nothing is more important than staying informed. So we are going to jump right into case studies, and we are going to use the war in Ukraine as a framing device for how we understand hacktivism in 2024. And there's a reason why threat researchers do this. The war in Ukraine really paradigmatically changes hacktivism as it had existed prior to 2022. There's a Recorded Future report that I wrote in 2021 about how hacktivism was dying, how it became obsolete, and boy, was I wrong come February of the next year. Hacktivism, especially in the context of the war in Ukraine, results in mass mobilization of incredible ideological and geographical diversity that really forms a lot of the way we understand hacktivism 2 years later. With regards to the war in Ukraine, the Recorded Future platform identifies approximately 75,000 references over the first year of the war to unique hacktivist attacks targeting entities in Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, NATO and EU member states, and other countries that support Ukraine, and so forth. But what is not necessarily represented here is approximately 250 hacktivist groups that we tracked on a daily basis, and over 24 hacktivist collectives or brands that hacktivists use to amplify their messaging. We see this significant spike and fall off in March of 2022, and the reasoning for that is largely because hacktivists have a short attention span. There is a significant amount of turnover when we get to April, May, and June of 2022. But the interesting thing about this is of those 250 groups I just mentioned, roughly 30 still remain, and those 30 are really loud, and we're going to talk about a couple of them in a few minutes. When the war in Ukraine begins, we see significant ideological diversity on the pro-Ukrainian side versus the pro-Russian side, which is pretty monolithic, just pro-Russian at that point. And again, we'll talk about kind of how state-sponsored actors and advanced persistent threat groups factor into the equation. But really the focus of this talk is going to be on these two groups on the bottom, these financially motivated and ego-driven groups. So financially motivated and ego-driven groups are going to kind of act as your spoiler. If you're familiar with terrorism and conflict theory, the spoiler is the individual that wants to continuously escalate. They want to escalate for the purpose of maintaining hostilities and exploiting it for self-serving purposes. These financially motivated and ego-driven actors largely overshadow everyone else here for the sake of financial gain, for the sake of making a whole lot of noise. So we're going to dive first into a case study that I think a lot of people are going to be familiar with that has changed dramatically over the last decade or so. So for those of you familiar with Anonymous, like I said earlier, Anonymous in 2024 is not the Anonymous of the mid-2000s. Anonymous in 2024 is primarily a brand. It is primarily an amplification channel for pre-established hacktivist and cybercriminal groups. So of this brand, we at Recorded Future identified approximately 35 independent hacktivist groups that claim to be members of Anonymous, claim to participate in hashtag #OpRussia or hashtag #OpBelarus, and the overwhelming majority of these groups are criminals in nature. So almost every single one was active on the now defunct RAID forums and its successor Breach forums. Groups such as GhostSec, which is now operating a ransomware extortion operation with Stormus, Kelvin Sec Team, which is primarily a cybercriminal group that was taken down in Spain earlier this year, Against the West, or Blue Hornet, or APT41, whatever it was calling itself that week. Primarily a hacktivist group, a so-called hacktivist group that was selling databases for RAID forums credits, which is a useless form of currency on dark web forums. But again, almost all of these groups were financially motivated in nature. And the reasoning behind this is because with the dawn of messaging platforms like Telegram and with the public-facing nature of dark web forums as it exists today, a lot of these threat actors understood that there was a lot of publicity and a lot of, I guess, names to be made for themselves if they participated in hostilities, given that the entire world was watching what was happening in cyberspace with regards to Russia and Ukraine. So we get into this question of shifting motivations. The Anonymous brand is just a brand, similar to how Lockbit as a ransomware group is just a brand for the affiliate, right? The affiliate is actually conducting attacks, not necessarily the Lockbit operators. Anonymous was really just a brand for these pre-established so-called affiliates, these pre-established financially motivated groups. But this brand has changed significantly over the last 10 to 15 years and has since been largely co-opted by financially motivated actors. Anonymous now really just serves as an amplification channel. So if there's anything you take away from kind of this specific case study, it's that be mindful of groups that largely have massive followings on social media or on Telegram or well-established brand names, because that's really all they are. Similar to ransomware, they are brand names for affiliates. One of the affiliates that I kind of want to highlight that is of the Anonymous collective in the early days of the war in Ukraine is Network Battalion 65. So Network Battalion 65 is really interesting because over its entire lifespan, it claims responsibility for less than 5 cyber attacks. But of those 5 cyber attacks, it actually resulted in significant disruptive and destructive action against Russian entities. How? Well, Network Battalion 65 was basically operating like a ransomware gang, deploying the leaked Conti ransomware builder that was the result of the Conti and TrickBot leaks in early March of 2022. If you want to know more about the Conti leaks, I did a whole talk at RSA last year about it and that entire mess, so definitely check that out. But Network Battalion 65 is not necessarily the loudest of all of the groups I just mentioned, but it is the most damaging, which kind of brings us to a pretty key point in that volume does not equate to impact. Successful cyber attacks, especially ones that are requiring the full ransomware kill chain, like observed with Network Battalion 65, require time, resources, personnel, skill, and experience, which most hacktivist groups do not have access to, which is why the overwhelming majority of them claim responsibility for DDoS attacks that are generally mitigated, 99% of the time. Network Battalion 65 is a significant outlier for this reason because despite only claiming responsibility for less than 5 attacks, particularly the Russian All-State Broadcasting Company, or VGTRK, destroying effectively its entire backups and taking it offline for 2 weeks, it was not necessarily as publicized as other groups I mentioned, like Against the West, or DemonSec, or LulzSec Mafia, which were all over the news for conducting DDoS attacks that really resulted in no impact. It is irresponsible if you work at an organization to set your threat intelligence requirements based solely on the volume of attacks, because volume does not equate to impact. And there's a perfect example of that. Oh boy, every single threat intelligence analyst just groaned seeing KillNet come up on the screen. So KillNet is one of those groups that claimed responsibility for a whole lot but did very little. So over KillNet's existence, especially in the first 6 months, it claims responsibility for approximately 300 DDoS attacks on random entities located in Ukraine, Europe, North America. Its allies like UserSec, Anonymous Sudan, and Anonymous Russia in total claim responsibility for approximately 1,000 DDoS attacks, 97% of which resulted in little to no impact. So the overwhelming majority of claims shared by a group like KillNet were false, misleading, or exaggerated in impact, but KillNet amassed tens of thousands of followers on social media, amplifying their messaging and catching the attention of mainstream news. When we talk about a group like Network Battalion 65, a group that actually results in impact but doesn't really claim responsibility for much and is not well known to the industry, versus a group like KillNet that is primarily driving malign influence, it brings up a lot of questions as to not only motivation, but whether or not we just ignore this activity outright. KillNet belongs to a sect within hacktivism that we call the clout chasers. What these groups primarily do is they chase ego, they chase attention by claiming responsibility for really as much as possible, despite most of it being disproven. The goal of this is to get the alleged victim to actually acknowledge an attack from KillNet. Therefore, KillNet can say, hey, we took down Bradley International Airport in the United States. Bradley International Airport acknowledged that they were under a DDoS attack. Therefore, we are very serious. We are very important. You need to pay attention to us, despite the Bradley International Airport website, which was just really an informational site being taken offline for about 3 minutes. This is really kind of the underpinning of how hacktivists function, especially pro-Russian groups that are really just looking to drive malign influence and sow chaos amongst their followers. These groups really just serve as amplification channels. KillNet at its peak had about 75,000 followers on Telegram, more than most of the groups in Anonymous that I mentioned combined, and they were known for repurposing a lot of old and misattributed breaches. You need to pay a lot of attention to this kind of stuff, because if a group is really going out of their way to claim responsibility for as much as possible that cannot be verified by a third party and results in no impact, then you seriously need to reassess requirements based on that group's activity and potential threats to your organization. Now, a pro-Russian group that actually did result in a lot of impact, and when I say pro-Russian, there's a lot of air quotes around this one, is Free Civilian. So about 90 minutes before the war in Ukraine began, before Russia invaded, Free Civilian appeared on the now defunct RAID forums and dropped a link to a dark web extortion blog where it listed a series of Ukrainian targets, databases for sale, initial access for sale. In time, over investigation, Free Civilian has since been attributed to Ember Bear, which deployed Whispergate a month prior. So Whispergate being a wiper attributed to the Russian GRU. Free Civilian was attributed to Ember Bear by CrowdStrike, by Recorded Future, and by Mandiant, largely as a pseudo-hacktivist group intended to provide plausible deniability for the Russian state. Plausible deniability is really important. So in order for covert intelligence action to actually take place, the government needs to leverage non-state actors or personas in order to absolve themselves of accountability. When it comes to groups that generally have no credibility, that have never been seen before, but are claiming responsibility for things like Free Civilian that are largely verifiable, that has victimology overlaps with previous intrusion sets or has victimology overlaps with things like wipers, you always must consider in the back of your mind that there is the potential for an adversarial intelligence agency to have some hand in this. And this is not only substantiated in the Free Civilian case and several cases that I'll talk about with Israel and Palestine, but this is a well-known MO of sandworm. If you have not read Mandiant's recent report on unmasking sandworm and graduating it to APT 44, I highly recommend it. Sandworm and the GRU known to leverage hacktivist personas like Hacknet, which was aligned with Killnet, Solnt-Sepek, which targeted telecommunications infrastructure in Ukraine, and the Cyber Army of Russia Reborn, which was recently identified for targeting water and wastewater systems in Texas and Indiana. So again, plausible deniability is really important, and we're going to talk about a lot of this with regards to Israel and Palestine because of how recent some of these examples are. So Israel and Palestine really provides a parallel example to the war in Ukraine, because a lot of the groups that we see active in Israel and Palestine right now are groups that were previously active with regards to the context of the war in Ukraine, but have since changed their focus of their operations. So this is a great graphic from my friend CyberKnow, who kind of looks at all of the hacktivist groups that are proliferated on social media, dark web forums, and Telegram. And what he identifies is that there's approximately 137 groups as of a month after Hamas's October 7th attack on Israel that become active. This is a significant rise in the amount of groups that initially started at the war in Ukraine, and there's a significant disparity too. The overwhelming majority of groups that we and others have identified are largely not necessarily pro-Palestinian, but anti-Israel, and there's a reasoning for this. A lot of these groups include pro-Russian groups that are targeting Israel almost exclusively because of the strategic security partnership that Israel has with the United States. A lot of these groups are from South and Southeast Asia that are targeting Israel for largely contradictory geopolitical beliefs. These groups are largely pre-established, they're largely financially motivated, and they're seeking to capitalize again on international instability and human suffering for financial gain. So to kind of start off, a good example that caught everyone's attention when the war began was a group called CyberTufan, active on breach forums. So CyberTufan, when the war begins, claims that over the course of 30 days, they're going to release 1 to 2 unique Israeli databases per day for 30 days and then retire. This immediately was a red flag, because for us that follow hacktivism, we know that a group voluntarily declaring a campaign and retiring is a little bit fishy. The thing that was incredibly fishy about CyberTufan is that over its existence, the databases it claimed responsibility for were not previously identified on dark web forums. We can't verify the authenticity of them, but they had not been reposted elsewhere. They appeared to constitute new and unique data, and CyberTufan kind of pulled through on their promise. After 30 days, they retired, they took their website down, they closed their account on breach forums, and they called it a day. While we cannot make an attribution for CyberTufan at this time, this behavior is incredibly bizarre and signals to a lot of us influence operations. Tempo and volume are incredibly important when assessing the claims of hacktivist groups. As I said earlier, with Network Battalion 65, successful attacks and unique attacks take time, resources, and skill. To drop 2 to 3 new unique databases every single day for 30 days straight is incredibly bizarre. Hacktivist groups rarely know when to call it quits. Their egos simply will not allow it. So contained campaigns from start to finish is another red flag that you need to be considerate of. And while we cannot attribute CyberTufan at this time, a group we can attribute to the IRGC Cyber Electronic Command, or the CEC, is Cyber Avengers. So Cyber Avengers is another case study in how foreign adversarial intelligence agencies leverage hacktivism or pseudo-hacktivism in order to advance statecraft. Cyber Avengers appears in November of 2023, about a month after the war in Israel and Palestine begins, and Cyber Avengers immediately claims responsibility for attacks on U.S. critical infrastructure. In particular, they target Unitronics, Israeli-made programmable logic controllers that were used in water and wastewater systems in the United States. So they cause a significant disruption in Pennsylvania, results in an FBI, CISA bulletin, and U.S. sanctions against Cyber Avengers. Cyber Avengers has since been attributed by practically everyone, Mandiant, CrowdStrike, Recorded Future, as as IRGC Cyber Electronic Warfare Command. Now, very similarly to Free Civilian and Ember Bear, Cyber Avengers is a parallel example in Israel and Palestine to the war in Ukraine, where Iranian intelligence services leverage hacktivist personas for plausible deniability. Plausible deniability is really important because, as I've mentioned many times throughout this presentation, a nation-state being able to deny themselves the accountability for an attack when we have this attribution problem and not necessarily everyone can action on evidence, and at the same time when sanctions and indictments do very little of law enforcement significance to hackers located within, Iran and Russia, plausible deniability is incredibly important. Attacks on critical infrastructure are few and far between. I can name right now 2 groups with regards to both Russia and Ukraine and Israel-Palestine that have claimed attacks on critical infrastructure, those being Cyber Army of Russia Reborn and Cyber Avengers. It's incredibly bizarre, even more so, to see attacks on critical infrastructure in the US, which is not a direct party to either the war in Ukraine or the wars in Israel and Palestine. So given the resource question, the attribution problem, and issues about plausible deniability, attacks on critical infrastructure, again, are a bit of a red flag and something that warrants far more attention than, say, a group like Killnet posting a bunch of random stuff on Telegram. Another group that posts a lot of random stuff on Telegram and on breach forums is a group called SiegeSec. So this is another great example of a group that was primarily pro-Ukrainian, participating in Op Russia, part of the Anonymous Collective, that suddenly becomes a financially motivated threat actor for seemingly no reason in the middle of last year, and has continued to target entities for financial gain. So SiegeSec, despite claiming to be a hacktivist, despite claiming to be pro-Palestinian, is largely running around on breach forums, selling databases, a lot of which are recycled for forum credits and for cryptocurrency. This brings up a lot of questions about verifying databases. So we see a lot of claims, whether they're posted on social media, on Telegram, or on dark web forums, that are almost always recycled, public, or misattributed. So SiegeSec is known for doing this, recycling the work of other threat actors, posting public information. SiegeSec very recently posted a classified CIA document, and it was something unclassified from the 60s that was openly accessible on the CIA website. They also claimed to have gotten back-end access to the CIA and posted like the DOM file for the website's design. Again, completely useless, but it grows their credibility within dark web forums. And they often misattribute breaches. So they often claim that the victim is someone completely different than the real victim, which is usually not a party to the conflict. This is an intentional practice. So hacktivists are often largely intentional in mislabeling databases, presenting the impact as more significant than it actually is, and the purpose of this is almost always media and researcher attention. Hacktivists understand that journalists and researchers are on these forums too, that they are also following them on Telegram, and in order to gain their attention, they often post misleading, exaggerated, and audacious claims in order to get us to respond. SiegeSec is one of the many groups that do this, but it's a good case study in always verifying something. Never make a decision within your organization about, say, a breach or instigating an incident response if you yourself are not able to verify the authenticity of a database, or you're not able to seek third-party corroboration about an attack on a dark web forum. Now, the last example that really hits home when it comes to the financial motivation of hacktivist groups is this attack on the Palestinian National Institute of Public Health. So this threat actor on breach forums claims to be a pro-Israeli, anti-Hamas, very bizarre, contradictory, and confusing ideology, but they claim to be targeting an entity that is associated with Hamas, and it's not at all. It's a legitimate UN-funded organization in the West Bank. Palestinian National Institute of Public Health has a breach in October of 2023. This threat actor, for the sake of Israel, claims to be selling for $700 full back-end access to the Palestinian National Institute of Public Health, whether through a guarantor on the forum or in private messages. This threat actor, this hacktivist, sells this database or sells this access to another hacktivist, who about 48 hours later drops the entire database for forum credits onto breach forums. A perfect example of how hacktivist groups, even if they're self-proclaimed hacktivist groups, will target entities that clearly are intended to provide support for civilians and refugees, clearly UN-funded legitimate organizations, doing this for the sake of capitalizing on urgency and capitalizing on human suffering for $700 and a bunch of useless credits. This database was verified, 200,000 records of protected health information related to Palestinian residents of the West Bank, civilians who have nothing to do with the conflict, who, again, were exploited purely for financial gain and useless financial gain, forum credits. So again, in the context of Israel and Palestine, something that's really important is there's a sense of urgency here. There's a demand and there's an opportunism on behalf of threat actors to exploit access and to exploit databases, and the turnaround time that we identify is roughly 48 hours. Hacktivists and cybercriminals alike practice situational awareness. They are sensitive to geopolitical developments, and they will never pass up an opportunity to make some money and boost their reputation if that opportunity is given to them. So we'll get into some conclusions. So given all these case studies, what can we take away from this? So since its beginning, hacktivism has always been reactionary, but it's always generally been a hallmark of internet subculture and a form of legitimate protest. Over time, and especially in 2024, it is primarily now a driver of malign influence, whether that is propaganda, whether that is chaos for financial gain, or whether that is nation-state influence. The overwhelming majority of claims shared by hacktivists on social media, messaging platforms, and dark web sources are false, misleading, or exaggerated in impact. This is entirely intentional. This is by design. They are trying to get you to effectively respond to this. They are trying to get you to instigate incident response, to brief your organizations on this impending serious hacktivist threat, where generally speaking, it doesn't exist. It is always important to avoid making hasty decisions as the result of unverified hacktivist chatter. So looking forward, in conclusion, we assess that this is the new norm. We assess that financially, politically, and even religiously motivated threat actors will continue to capitalize on international instability and human suffering for personal and financial gain. As demonstrated through some of the case studies with the wars in Israel and the wars in Ukraine, motivations are increasingly insincere, they are opaque, they are contradictory, they often don't even make sense when they're first presented. This is, again, on purpose because a lot of hacktivists are self-serving. A lot of the misinformation and disinformation spread by hacktivists will continue to pose a threat to organizations, largely because without situational awareness, broad public education, and broad threat intelligence awareness campaigns, organizations and individuals might not know how to assess authenticity, how to assess credibility, and therefore they might make hasty decisions about their strategic cybersecurity posture based on relatively nothing. So this is what I leave you with. There's nothing more important than being patient and exercising restraint and understanding that in 2024, hacktivism is primarily driven by mis and disinformation. So questions, you can use the mics over there. If not, you can talk to me afterwards or find me at the conference or send me messages on social media or email. But thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Very interesting talk. My name is Jay Bryan. I'm a cyber risk professional at a financial institution. So I know that activists are interested in bringing about social change.
Yep.
And many are in the streets protesting,
Yep.
right? Not
Yep.
really reactionary in the sense of, okay, there's an urgent matter that needs to be responded to. And then hackers, cyber criminals are that. And they're very skilled, and often that's their job, and can be open for hire by nation states. I'm not sure if many local activist groups can afford their services. So I'm just wondering about the conflation of activism when the group is interested in, is motivated by financial gain.
For sure.
I think it's just like their job. And maybe they use some hashtags because they're just individual people who care about
For sure. I mean, that is the important question, whether or not these are actually activists and whether or not they're actually looking for social change. Hacktivists in particular are always opportunistic. They're always looking for, they're always reactionary and looking to respond to things that are happening in the world nowadays. So something very interesting, a contemporary example, is we see a lot of the demonstrations on college campuses here in the US. Hacktivist groups, particularly ones that have been previously attributed to the IRGC, like the Cyber Avengers, are exploiting tensions on campus for the sake of proliferating Iranian state-sponsored agendas. This is really concerning because hacktivists, again, they practice situational awareness, and the question about whether or not they can actually be defined as hacktivists falls into that question of whether or not they are fighting for transparency, whistleblowing, or vandalism. Overwhelming majority of them are fighting for effectively vandalism. That's what the argument is.
Okay, one more thing. So an organization claiming to be the perpetuator of some cyber attack, and I know activists who are in the streets mobilizing and organizers that, anonymity is super important. Why would they want to claim, but these hacktivists who are claiming credit for, it just seems like a completely different discipline, domain. It just doesn't seem like activism.
It is completely different, and it is you're 100% correct. It has morphed over time into something that doesn't even resemble fighting for legitimate social change anymore.
Do you want to go?
No, go right ahead.
Okay. Hi, Alexander. My name is Alex. I was at your presentation last year. My question is, you mentioned really about these groups engaging in attacks and misattributing themselves to the attacks. I'm wondering if you've seen these groups mention something that an actor in the war, in Israel between Palestine, did that didn't happen. So let's say one of the, Cyber Avengers, let's say they said, oh, Israel did this, and they were spreading it across the world. Did that happen? Or maybe if Israel did the same thing?
Well, mis and disinformation is a cornerstone of hacktivism. It's a cornerstone of influence operations. Not pointing to any specific examples, but something that we did see in the beginning of the war in October of 2023 was several hacktivist groups claiming responsibility and participation in the Hamas attack on Israel, which didn't necessarily make much sense given that a lot of these groups were pro-Russian. A lot of these groups are located in North America and Western Europe, legitimately claiming responsibility to be there on the ground, something that obviously is a lie and obviously is a bunch of nonsense. Something else we saw hacktivist groups claiming responsibility for was attacks on critical infrastructure in Israel and Palestine when the war began, most of which were attributed to kinetic attacks, attacks on electrical grids, telecommunications infrastructure, had nothing to do with cyber and no evidence of cyber whatsoever, but still hacktivist groups were claiming responsibility on both sides of the conflict for cyber attacks that were nothing more than routine outages, kinetic attacks. A lot of groups claiming responsibility for the shutdown of internet service in Gaza. That was entirely voluntary. It was entirely done also at the command of the IDF. It was done with attacks on critical infrastructure in Gaza, had nothing to do with hacktivism whatsoever. We saw half a dozen groups claiming responsibility for that internet shutoff that they clearly were not responsible for.
Hi, Dr. Wunstetter. Just a couple of questions on the victimology that you had mentioned. I was particularly interested in that. Have you identified trends in the victims of hacktivists, whether they are opportunistic hacktivists or more career-driven hacktivists?
Yeah, 100%. So there's a report. I recommend going onto the Recorded Future website. We've got our annual report where we talk about this trend in particular. We identify that, attacks within the theater of conflict itself. So attacks within, say, Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, or attacks within entities in Israel and Palestine are usually limited to a 30-day window. So after that 30-day window is over, hacktivist groups usually either lose attention, which is what you saw in that graph earlier, where there's a massive fall-off in activity and the activity of groups, or they transition to targeting new entities that they kind of do these mental gymnastics, 4D math, in order to target entities, say, in Belgium. Why? Because Belgium is providing ammunition to the IDF. Like, that's kind of the method behind it. But usually what it is, this is a 30-day window. They realize that the potential for continuing attacks, like there's such a thing as fatigue, and there's also a thing in influence operations called influence fatigue, where influence actors understand that people become resilient over time to malign narratives. Therefore, within 30 days, they often transition to new targets. So the window that we have for both theaters of conflict is 30 days before actors on either side of the conflict begin targeting entities in Japan, the United States, Canada, Iran, things like that.
Do you mind if I follow up with a quick? Has Recorded Future or yourself looked at the existing sort of real-world victimology theories and how they pertain to the concept of cyber victimology?
Yes, so something we can talk about more later, and I can send you those reports as well, but there's a lot that has to do with not only conflict theory and just war theory and how we kind of apply victimology in terms of collateral damage and stuff like that to hacktivism. I can send you those reports later, and we can sync up, and I could do it via email.
My name is Marco. I had a quick question about, you mentioned before that some groups or some nations are, using hacktivist groups as personas in order to introduce plausible deniability. I was wondering if there's been any examples of, like, the United States using a similar technique or using similar groups as cover.
So nothing that has been publicly reported in the context of either Ukraine or Israel-Palestine of the United States or a Five Eyes country, a NATO member state, leveraging hacktivist personas. This is primarily a public-facing malign influence operation because the United States, generally speaking, in terms of strict threat intelligence, does not engage in influence operations at the same cadence, the same tempo as adversarial nations, which are also easily detectable by US threat intelligence companies. So I can't speak necessarily to whether or not the United States has used hacktivist personas in the past, but given the kind of that attribution problem and that issue that I mentioned earlier about biases within evidence, the overwhelming majority of threat intelligence companies are based in the US and in Western Europe. We're not necessarily mitigating against attacks emanating out of North America and Europe. It's mostly adversarial states. So while I can't speak to it, the evidence is rather scant because that's not necessarily like the shape of the threat intelligence industry as it exists today and kind of the market value and stuff, which is not necessarily a good answer, but that's the answer, evidence bias. Okay, thank you. Thank you for coming, and yeah.